Now, at Ghislaine Maxwell's 2021 trial, Annie Farmer described being attacked by Epstein in New Mexico while she was still a minor, again just 16, and claiming that Ghislaine Maxwell also played a direct role. Annie's sister, Maria, actually went on to report Epstein to authorities as early as 1996, years before he was ever prosecuted. Now, police records do show that Maria told authorities that Epstein stole nude photographs of her and her sisters and allegedly threatened to her, yet the FBI has never publicly acknowledged acting on that report. Annie Farmer has been brave and outspoken in her journey to hold both Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell, as well as the United States government accountable. Farmer even appearing alongside fellow survivors on Capitol Hill in November of last year, where she highlighted the government's lack of action. Watch.
This is not an issue of a few corrupt Democrats or a few corrupt Republicans. This is a case of institutional betrayal. Because these crimes were not properly investigated, so many more girls and women were harmed. 30 years later, even as oceans of allegations and obvious truths have emerged, the government has still not chosen transparency. This is why we have all come together as one united voice to demand the release of all the Epstein files and to finally bring the truth out of the shadows.
Annie Farmer is now a psychologist who specializes in helping people with anxiety, grief, and trauma recovery. And she joins me now live right here on American Agenda to discuss the very latest in the Epstein investigation. Annie, thank you so much for joining me to share your story and that of the other survivors. And before you even say a word, I want to point out that the word here is survivors, not victims. Now, I want to start by asking you here. Yes, of course. And one of the things that a lot of, I know other survivors are concerned about with the latest release of the files, which of course many of you want, is that the redactions actually exposed some of the survivors' personal information. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think it's hard for the average American that hasn't actually delved into these documents to realize just how problematic this release was in terms of the redaction errors. But there were full, pages of names of survivors that were completely unredacted or with one redaction. And some of these were minors at the time that these crimes were committed against them who had remained Jane Does and never been exposed before. And so in addition to that, we have learned that there were photos, actually nude photos of girls and young women that were released by our government. And so these kinds of things, I think it's hard for people to understand just how damaging that can be. We're learning of survivors that are in Eastern Europe who have been harassed because of their names becoming public in this way. And, so it's really, I think, important that people understand this is not how victims of crimes should be treated. There are protocols in place to protect them for a reason, and we need answers about why that was allowed to happen.
Annie, what are the survivors who you work with, what are you all hoping for at this point?
I think there's a few things. One is that we are hoping felt so proud about the bipartisan legislation that we helped to pass, right, and the support that we got on both sides of the aisle. And that Transparency Act was very clear in saying that predators should not be protected, but victims and survivors should. And so we really want the DOJ to follow the letter of the law here and to remove the redactions that are still in place for people that were involved in these crimes. We're also hoping that there will be true investigations. We're seeing that there is a lot of information that looks like it has never been followed up on in any way. And we just are asking what all, I think, victims of crimes are asking for, which is, we want a true investigation so that if charges should be brought, they are, and there can be prosecutions of these people. And also, I think just that there are people who were, involved in making sure in our government that this did not get the light that it deserved. And so looking at the institutional level, answering these questions, as you mentioned in the opening, my sister Maria Farmer reported this in 1996, and we still don't have answers to the very important questions of why was it not investigated at that time.
Annie, you were just 16 in 1996, as we said, when you were attacked by Jeffrey Epstein. How did that affect you at this time? Have you ever gotten to a point where you feel that you're at peace?
Yeah, I think when something happens so early in your life, it often has a tremendous impact on, and I think that, in terms of things like trust and a sense of safety, I feel like I've had a lot of opportunity, to work through that. And really a big part of healing has been coming together with other survivors and feeling that sense of community and that sense of purpose. As we have spoken out, as you showed at Capitol Hill, I think there has been just this sort of sense that there's a lot of strength in numbers. And, my sister, Maria Farmer, she's filed this lawsuit to highlight the negligence of the government in this case. And I think everyone coming together and saying, yes, we deserve answers, and kind of supporting her as we push for those answers has felt like it's brought me some peace.
I'm happy to hear that. I cannot imagine what that must have been like. But again, you are helping other victims. Just when we talk about victims and survivors all the time, but survivors, how many of you are there essentially? I mean, we hear it as a plural, but I have no sense of how many women we're talking about, girls.
Yeah. Well, the DOJ estimates I've seen are over 1,000.
Wow.
I've seen some estimates as high as 1,200. And of course, I'm in touch with a much smaller group of individuals, but I have continued to hear, as I've been more public, new people sometimes reach out to me and also share their stories of being abused by Epstein and Maxwell and others. So I think it really is a quite large group of people, which is why it is so important. We are daughters and sisters and mothers, members of our community, members of churches. We are people who are trying to lead our lives, and advocating for this case has taken, I think, quite a toll on many of us. And it also, I think is just taking a toll on survivors more generally as they're watching what's happening, which is why it is so important, I think, that the DOJ, does the right thing here and sends a strong message that victims of these types of crimes will be believed, will be supported. It is certainly not a bipartisan issue. Child safety, right? We want children and women to be protected.
Yeah, that's the bottom line here. When you are with some of the fellow survivors and the cameras are off and you're all just together, what are those conversations like?
I think that there's this sense of connection that is deeper than you would expect, considering some of us haven't known each other for a very long time. But because of the shared experience and being, joined in this fight together, there really is a camaraderie. And there's a lot of, just venting about the stress, sharing fears and worries, and also sharing our hopes for what we can accomplish at this time.
We also know that the family of Virginia Giuffre, the late victim of Jeffrey Epstein, is sending a very strong message to Ghislaine Maxwell after pleading the fifth during her deposition, writing in an open letter, "Ghislaine, you deserve to spend the rest of your life in a jail cell, trapped in a cage forever, just like you trapped your victims." Chilling words there. Obviously, a very impossible situation. But when you hear something like that, what does justice being served look like for you and for the other survivors?
I think justice is complicated, but I'm very much in agreement with Virginia's family about the fact that Ghislaine Maxwell needs to serve her sentence and should do so in a facility that's the proper security level, right? Not where she is at this time. But more broadly, I think, we're looking for accountability, and that means, individuals that were involved in criminal activities just, should be prosecuted. They should be investigated and prosecuted if appropriate. And then we're also seeing that there are individuals that are facing more sort of social and professional losses at this time as their connections to Epstein are exposed. And I think that that's a really important piece as well, because these are not people that I think any of us want to be trusting, our children's education to or our healthcare decisions to if they were willing to look the other way on pedophilia, right? And then third, I'd say, accountability and justice. I think we were not only harmed by these perpetrators, but many of us feel like we were harmed by the system, and it's been decades long, as we've said, across administrations. And so that's why I think my sister Maria's lawsuit is so important, highlighting the negligence of the government so that we can make sure that this doesn't happen to survivors again in the future.
Annie, we're just about out of time, but what message would you like to share with potential other survivors out there who may have gone through something similar that you or some of your, I'll say, newfound sisters have gone through?
Number one, you're not alone. There are many people who have unfortunately experienced similar things. So you can feel very isolated, but you're not alone. And number two, it is important for you to find safe places to speak about and share what's happened to you. And through that, through finding your community, there is the chance for healing and advocacy.
Well, Annie Farmer, again, you've taken such a horrible situation and you have made the best out of it, helping other people. So I know that so many people admire and thank you for that. And I thank you for being here with me on American Agenda and sharing your story. Thank you.
Oh, I so appreciate it. Thank you.